welcome everybody. I'm here again with my good friend John Michell, who's been on this program once before. This time we're talking about a very different subject. It's very close to John Michel's heart. I know he's very passionate about this subject and he's an author on the subject. He's written this text on a particular version of the tarot known as the Marseille Tarot. So today's conversation is going to be about the tarot. We're going to dive deep into this subject. It's rich with so many opportunities for exploring history, philosophy, astrology, theology, the mysteries. It goes on and on. And is it relevant for today? I think it's highly relevant. I read some statistic the other day that in the last few years, there's been over $1 billion in tarot decks sold worldwide. It's now a big industry.
It has been for a while, yeah.
Yeah, and it seems to be growing. And is this all about just luck and chance or is there something deeper going on that's connected to, I know your background in so many different areas, from being a Steiner school principal to, being a Kundalini yoga teacher, to being an author on the tarot and many other subjects. And I think you've also lectured worldwide on and given seminars around the world. So I'd say you are an accepted figure in the world of tarot.
I guess I am in terms of tarot.
And very well credentialed to be talking about this subject. And I think you're off to Italy soon to speak at another conference.
Next week.
So the tarot is rich in history. I just wonder how far it goes back. I mean,
okay,
where does it start? Does it start with the Egyptians? Does it start with the pharaohs? Does it start with the Italians? What are the influences? Okay. I just like starting at the beginning sometimes. Right now, always we can see where this evolves though. But yeah.
Okay, so that's where does it start? What is tarot and where does it start?
Yeah.
I'll cut to the chase and then I'll go back a little bit. The very first tarot decks or tarot-like decks came around in the 1440s, so the 15th century. Prior to that, there were other decks around, but for example, the Memluk decks, but they were only what we now refer to as the minor arcana or the standard playing deck. So the tarot, which is, if you like, you take that basic deck of normal playing cards and you add to it what we now refer to as the major arcana.
The 22.
The 20, but arcana. We now say 22. But the very first ones in the 1440s very likely only had 16 major arcana cards. Right. Now, it could be that of the 16 that we have, there are others that were lost, but chances are there were only 16. And that's why tarot then, there's some say a deck like tarot is around the 1440s. It stabilizes between 1440 and definitely by 1650 you have the 22 trumps or the 22 major arcana. They probably stabilized to 22 around 1500, but that's conjecture. So where were they made? They were made originally for the Visconti Sforza family. That's the earliest known decks.
As a game?
Very likely used partly as a game. They're very likely used as symbolic figures as well. What their actual purpose was is a little bit difficult to know, because obviously, if you look at the standard set of cards, they were used as a game.
Yes.
And then you have, like, if you think about a game like 500, in which you have the 4 suits and you designate one as having trumps, as being the trumps. Well, by adding figures, you have permanent trumps.
Right.
And even if we talk about modern tarot, even in France nowadays, even when I was growing up, there is actually a card game called tarot, which we use as a standard tarot deck. Right. It's actually a gambling deck as well.
Yeah.
The ones that they use nowadays, of course, use what we call the French suits, which is also the English ones, which is hearts, clubs, etc. But I can talk about when they changed over as well later on, if you like. But in terms of then where does tarot come from?
Or the influences?
Around the 1440s is the earliest, what I'll call proto-tarot, not quite tarot. And I would say it stabilizes definitely by the 1500s, but the evidence is not before the 1600s.
So okay, we've got a date there. It's a long time ago, and it's been a lot of tarot, in the world over the last 500 or 600 years, originating from that event, I guess. Mm-hmm. But if we then now start looking at the imagery that's incorporated in the tarot, the wonderful symbology in there. I mean, there's the wands, there's the swords, there's the pentacles, there's the hearts, there's the traditional implements that are portrayed on the cards, as well as the images of the people on there as well. And everything has meaning, doesn't it? I mean, nothing. I mean, if you take, there's totally 78 cards, aren't there, in the deck? Mm-hmm. And then you look at each card. Within each card, there's probably a dozen. So let's angles to look at. Someone's looking down, or they're looking up, or they're holding a staff looking north, or they're looking south. They're wearing a robe. So when you look at the potential for a reading with 78 cards, and then the number of symbols on each card, we're talking a huge quantum in terms of number of probabilities of drawing out any one particular layout. Yeah. And the symbols in that layout. Okay. It's almost infinite.
I want to go back a little bit, okay? So let's just, because even if we look at just the 22 trumps, or the 22 major arcana, I'm likely to call them trumps more often than major arcana because of my historical background. But if you look at just those 22, if you were to draw only 2 cards, that's already 231 possibilities, just with those 22.
Right.
So you've got an enormous number of different possibilities of permutations. If you want to use the mathematical term, if you with 78.
Yes.
And also by the time you have a standard 10 card reading, or you even with those 10 cards, their order becomes significant in terms of how you're going to read. In the same way, we only have 26 letters in the alphabet, or 22 in the Hebrew alphabet, and you can write an infinite number of books, an infinite number of sentences. So in the same way, you can actually have as you said, an infinite number of possibilities of stories, of narratives that come out.
Yes.
Especially given that even the simple 2 words, the water, the context is going to give a different meaning if we're walking in the bush, to if we're walking in the desert, to if we're sitting at a table, to if we're about to cook
and the context is so subtle and so beautiful, and there's something so so alluring about the context in the cards that that drops you out of the thinking mind for a moment, doesn't it? It's profound in its ability to sort of draw into the archetypes and the subconscious, just the imagery itself, I guess, and that's probably why Jung and Steiner, and I know you spent a lot of time studying in those areas as well as the Kabbalah. They're all drawing on this ability to access the subconscious through symbology.
I'll just mention something very briefly about both Jung and Steiner. Both of them did actually refer to the tarot.
Yes.
But in a way that most people don't actually realize. So Jung did do some studies, and from his notes, and I've got a copy of his notes from the time, from his notes, it's obvious he used a deck that was either the Marseille style deck or something very similar. And Steiner, from memory, about 1906, did give a series of lectures in which he actually also referenced the tarot. But again, there are very few notes on that.
Yes.
So, and he also used a particular symbol that he placed on the Christmas tree in 1906 as well. Right. From memory, 1906. So look, I wasn't planning to talk about that. So. But what's interesting is that in about 2004, again, my date could be wrong there, maybe a bit later, we continued a international prize, and I had a sculptor in Melbourne design it was actually a brass, not a brass, what's the other word? There's combined brass and a bronze little statuette, okay. And he based that design on Steiner's symbol for the tarot.
Right.
And Mary Greer was the recipient of that, right. Following an international consortium of who should actually win.
So the odds of drawing out any particular layout are infinitesimally huge, aren't they? It's the equivalent to winning lotto. Sort of say, I'm going to draw these 3 cards. The odds of drawing those.
Well, yes, but again, when you're dealing with lotto, you're dealing with from what, 1 of 40 odd numbers, approximately. Okay, I know it varies depending on where in the world you're going. Yes. So, and you're drawing either 6 or 7 numbers.
Right.
So if you think about the odds of actually winning
tarot, it's even higher.
Winning lotto, it's very limited. There is a simple formula you can use to actually work it out. So to do a 10-card reading, sure, it's actually even more limited than that. But tarot isn't just used for reading purposes.
No.
So I think I just want to take a step back from that for a while, because otherwise it'll just give the impression that it's only for reading purposes.
Is it a superficial level, do you think? Or
no, I don't think it's superficial. I think it's a tool that can be used for self-reflective purposes,
like
to
window
allow
to the soul.
Yes, and also a window to opening up what you said before from logical thinking to actually allowing one's you might want to call it intuition, to actually be more forthcoming. If you want to go into modern neuroscience, it's the letting go of the left hemisphere's sense for wanting to control things to the right hemisphere's sense of wanting to be holistic in terms of accepting what's actually happening.
The ability to see the patterns, which is the right hemisphere.
And integrate.
Yeah. Ian McGilchrist has done some amazing work on, hasn't he? In his,
that's right.
Books.
And in both his main books as well. Yes, that's right. So I think so I'm not denigrating the reading aspect. In fact, I think it's an important element. But even to do that, it isn't just a matter of trying to have a free for all. If I go to any particular kind of image, it still has some constraints, and the constraints are based on the image itself, on the context of the image, etc. So, look, there's a really I like to sometimes quote Dante, and Dante wrote a letter to I can't remember the date now. But he said something like there are 2 ways to read a text, and one of them is the literal way. And the literal way gives rise to the symbolic way. The word he uses isn't symbolic. From which we have also the fourfold aspect of reading, which is from the physical, the literal, the what's actually there. And often when people start on cards, they forget to actually look at what's actually there. They want to go straight to the fourth level or the 3rd level. The 2nd level is the symbolic level. What are the symbols actually on there? What does it symbolically refer to? The next one is what he calls the moral level. What moral qualities or what moral influences or what moral meaning is actually being presented. And the 4th one is the anagogical, and in other words, the spiritual level. And for that, there is a kind of inner reflection that needs to take place, which if I'm giving you a reading, I'm not going to give you the anagogical because I cannot. I can give you the symbolic, I can give you the physical, the literal, the symbolic, and even the moral, but then it's your own reflections that are going to allow you to actually be open to that spiritual level.
I'm glad you said that, Jean-Michel. Wonderfully put. I hadn't heard Dante describe that before. And so that sort of brings me to the, that personal journey that the cards open up to your own inner wisdom, your own inner truth, which is your moment in a reading for your reflection, your aha moment, or maybe only looking back from sometime in the future, realizing the significance of some event that's happened in the past. So just before we move on out of this part of the discussion, I just wanted to touch on, how would you relate that to the intention that somebody has or they make in entering into a reading, for example? How important is that intention? And because we know now from the quantum, talk about what they call the quantum entanglement, this entanglement of consciousness, the perceiver and the perceived, and that there isn't, science is not able to remove the concept of the perceiver from the experiment, right? And so a reading is like a little experiment, isn't it? I mean, and you're a perceiver and you're observing it, and then there's that field of pure potential, which is the full potential of a 78 card reading. It's almost infinite. So there's the field, right? And then that field is collapsed with the act of observation, and then you have the wave particle type event with the layout of the cards. So how important is that consciousness, that intention in the whole process? Or is it only in reverse, like after you've
No, I think there's probably both. But I think in terms of quantum entanglement, then if we want to use that concept, there's certainly a sense in which there's a free-flowing field to which we are all part of.
Yes.
Look, the problem with answering, to go into that, I will go into it a little bit more, but part of the problem is that we're no longer talking specifically tarot, but rather looking at how we understand the world. So
we could come back philosophical. To that, so sort of throwing the net out a bit.
No, but that's good. And then from there to actually see how it actually becomes manifest in a particular wave, I'll call it.
Because I think this is part of the genius. I think some back there in the days, this was high technology. I think tarot was
right. But therefore, if I can take that then to actually explain something else, from my perspective, what actually happens is you've got this universal field.
Yes.
And I'll call it a spiritual field.
Yes.
And you've got this universal spiritual field that coalesces at different times throughout history, or continuously in different ways. And what you have is guiding principles, guiding tools, guiding insights, the coalescence of different things that happens at different times. Yes. So in ancient Greece, right through till about the time of the incarnation of Christ, you have Greek. I'll just talk about the West for now. Yes. We can talk about yoga and tantra and all that another time if you like. But you have these guiding principles, which are the four cardinal virtues. And so I'm going to refer back more to philosophy for a second, okay? Yes. Which are of course wisdom, temperance, justice, and prudence, fortitude. Prudence is one of the words that's used for wisdom. So okay. So you've got these four, and then at the time, roughly of the turn of the millennium, of roughly the time of Christ, and you have that reflected in Paul's letters, but right through
the Corinthians
until about right through and other places, right through until about the 15th century, the shift from the four cardinal virtues comes to what we now refer to as the three theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity or love. And these three kind of supersede and incorporate the four cardinal virtues. And around the time of tarot right to now, you have the three transcendentals that have emerged in the history of philosophy. Mm-hmm. That seem to be the principal guiding principles for our era. And I'm going to relate all this
Yes.
to tarot in a sec. Okay?
So, and that get the card out to actually
the truth
reflect these virtues. I'm sure.
Yes, the truth, the good and beauty.
Yes.
So the good, the beautiful, and the true. And these again supersede and incorporate all the other elements. And you can place these 10.
Yes.
You can place these 10 virtues on what's called the tree of life, on the actual Sephirah. And you can also, there is a particular way you can actually place the cards on the tree in the Sephirot themselves. Not like what the Golden Dawn does, which places it on the on interlinking paths, but in the Sephirot themselves. Now, what happens then is you have a reflection of those 10 virtues, the 3 transcendentals, the theological virtues, and the cardinal virtues, all reflected in very succinct ways in the imagery of the cards that emerges around the same time as well. Remember, 15th century. And that is also the time, by the way, that Steiner talks about there being a change in consciousness. So this is where I'm going to relate it back to consciousness and tarot. So he talks about the change of consciousness occurring around the year 1440, exactly at the time that tarot emerges. And in English, we call that a consciousness soul. In other words, now what happens is our moral decisions become fundamentally important. Before that, the ability to develop logic was more important. The ability to develop sequential thinking was more important. Now we can do that.
Imperial sort of model of...
Well, that kind of degenerates into what we now call imperialism, and virtually around the same time as well. So there's degeneration starting, I think, with Descartes and epitomized with Kant, and it becomes our mode of thinking in throughout the world, not just the West.
Yes,
that is degenerative, disconnected, and all that. And what tarot does is it counters that through imagination.
Yes.
But sorry, I've gone off a little bit off the track there. But it's all related to tarot, because you've got in tarot explicitly named some of the virtues. But there are, in the very earliest decks, there were no titles, there were no numbers. So you could interpret 1 or 2 or 3 of them as being wisdom, for example.
Right.
There's no card called wisdom in there, or prudence, right? In 1781, one person believes that the hangman is actually reversed and should be called prudence. I don't agree with that, but somebody else thinks the hermit should be called prudence, somebody or wisdom. Somebody else thinks...
What would you call the fool?
The fool, again, depends which version you look at. But the fool becomes, in some ways, when there's a person that becomes fully integrated, fully themselves, therefore they have a deep wisdom that reflects the divine. They often give the appearance to the external world as being but a fool. So the wisdom of God is but foolishness in the eyes of humanity, or something like that.
And isn't it a virtue, though? When we look back at some of the things and certainly in my life, and some of the decisions I've taken, and some of the directions I've gone down in terms of where I was going to move to, or career moves, or various occupations, there was a level of naivety looking back now.
Yeah.
But that if I didn't have the naivety, I wouldn't have made that step. If I didn't take that step, I wouldn't have had the experience, and I wouldn't have learnt. So it is that the naive sort of innocence is, and we see it in children that as well, and that's gives them that ability to be creative, to draw something different, or do some artwork, or play some music, or explore nature in a way that's that's that original quality, that sense of awe. Yeah,
and awe, and again, awe is one of those incredible words. Because it's actually the name of one of the Sephirah.
Okay.
And it's if you look at the figure of the tree of life, the one on the left that appears on the right, which represents the right-hand side, because it's as if you're looking at a person.
Right.
Geburah, the other name for Geburah is Pachad. And pacha means both. It's translated as both fear and awe.
Yes.
So when you have one of the translations in the Old Testament where it says, "Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom," it's the word that's used that can actually mean awe before the spiritual, awe before the divine is the beginning of wisdom. To be in awe allows you to be totally creative.
Yeah.
And there's a
it's a word you don't hear as much, but when you do think about it, it certainly has a quality to it that you start to feel into and wonder where's it where is it?
Yeah, fearsome. In
Nice.
the old English sense of the term, not in the modern sense of I'm afraid. Very different, very different. Yeah, so all those things are related to, I would say, the major arcana of the tarot.
Right.
Every single thing I've said, including the philosophical virtues that I've mentioned, the old ancient Greek, through to the theological ones, through to the transcendentals,
And was there a time in this period, from the 1400s, when this breakthrough came through, there was a shift that sort of coincided with the production and use of tarot and its acceptance and take-up at the time, and ever since. But was there a time when it was persecuted, or it ever had to go underground, or was, we're looking at not long after that, or during that period, you had the Inquisitions, you had...
It's a very interesting part that was, some people believe that the appellation or the naming as the Devil's Picture Book applied to the tarot. In fact, it didn't. It applied to playing cards that were used for gambling purposes.
Right.
So, but then it's only in the 20th century or late 19th century, I think it's the 20th century, that shifted the title, the Devil's Playing Cards, to the tarot. So the tarot, the only time it had to go not so much underground, but there were two movements that talked against images.
Right.
One were at the time of within the West, we're talking about the Western world again, the iconoclasts destroyed a lot of church imagery. They just destroyed anything that was image-like.
Yes.
And also with the Reformation, what happened is there was a move away from, again, imagery and a move towards just through one's own actions and efforts, and to link everything to the Bible in a more literal sense. So they didn't have to go underground, but they were dismissed in those regions or in those places. They just weren't used.
Okay.
So the Catholic Church definitely banned different games, but tarot was specifically excluded from that.
Right.
So it wasn't banned. And even if you look, even now, in the last 30 odd years, you've got at least 2 or 3 books that have come out by Catholic monks as well. And including, he was not a monk, but including the book Meditations on the Tarot. That is a very Christian hermetic work. So there were no times in which it had to go underground as such. But I think what happened is, and this is part of the stabilizing process, this field that we're talking about tries to find a way to actually incarnate, I'll call it, into the tarot. And as it goes through people, it kind of takes on mildly different forms. So around the 1500s, you've got a deck, I'll mention the names, but I'll talk about them a little bit, but probably not much.
Yes.
The Sologusca, which is not really a tarot, even though it has 78 cards. And the minor arcana of that deck, the major arcana looks totally different.
Right.
But the minor arcana, and they were being exhibited in the early 1900s at the British Museum, is where Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith gets their inspiration for the minor arcana.
Right, and that's the deck that the writers Waite, how do you pronounce it?
Yeah.
The deck, the most popular deck in use in the world today.
In English-speaking countries only.
Okay, and that was Coleman Smith was the artist.
She was the artist, yes. But that deck is only popular or very popular in English-speaking countries. And part of the popularity arises because in the 1960s, basically with the late 60s, with the hippie revolution, I'll call it a revolution. I was hesitant to use that term. You've got Stuart Kaplan, who owns US Games. He also published the deck.
Right.
And there was a little book by, I can't remember her name, just lost it. And she referenced that deck. And so he just produced more and more of that deck and literally made millions or hundreds of millions. And it's from that the Wade Smith, or the Rider was the first publisher, which is why it's called Rider Waite. That was designed in 1909. So it's from that they became really popular in English-speaking countries.
Yes.
In French-dominated areas, before the Marseille deck doesn't come from Marseille, by the way, but we'll come to that. Most Marseille decks don't come from Marseille. The design doesn't come from Marseille, but it's the title that's being accepted since the 1930s because of a very popular book in France called the Tarot de Marseille. In France, it's become the Marseille style decks. It's become the most popular because of that 1930 book, and that was produced by Grimaud. Grimaud is the equivalent of US Games, a very large producer of cards in France and throughout Europe. And then you also had, before that, you had the Eteia, which was more popular in France. And the Eteia was probably the most popular in France until the 1930s, 40s. And so you have different styles of decks that become popular, and then it reverts back to what I'll call the Marseille. And I mean, the book here, I've called it the Marseille Tarot, even though I'm referencing a Paris-based deck.
Right.
It's got nothing to do with Marseille. But again, I'm using what's it's known as. So what we have with the Wade Smith deck then is this sense in which it is influenced by the Solobusca. In the 1500s, there was also another deck called the Minchiate. There was also, so basically there were different styles of decks that were not tarot. But I think what happens is that there needs to be this spiritual basis tries to find its form. And one of the things that happens also around the late 15th century, 1492, in Spain, you have the expulsion of the Jews. You have the retaking over from Islam in the area, and so
it's King Ferdinand and Isabella.
It's also Charles V around the time, and Isabel. Yeah.
Yes.
And so what you have is you've got this incredible censorship, and there's a group of people called the crypto Jews that goes underground, and there's a very strong sense. Mark Philippus argues that you can see a stabilizing influence from the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet to the basic design of the deck.
Right, which were the 22 added cards to the...
Right, so the 22. Tarot. So prior to that, there may not be 22. There's definitely 16. There's another possibility of 18. Okay. So I suspect that this kind of weaving occurs in the early 1500s, and you've got minor iconographic changes that are made in order for many of the figures to even reflect the form of the Hebrew letter.
It's interesting this is sort of taking place in Spain, because in Spain and Portugal, the Knights Templars had a pretty strong presence at that time in history too, didn't they?
Yeah.
Particularly in Portugal.
Even in France. I mean, the reason the Knight Templars
they originated in France.
Yeah, but the reason they were, the whole thing against the Knight Templars was in part because the French king wanted to take over their
fortune.
The fortunes, because they had vast resources and lands. That's right. So, but you've got all this confluence of ideas that's actually happening. So my view is that the tarot, the major arcana of the tarot, become a spiritual visual input that gets influenced by a few different impulses, including what I call the crypto Jews. Basically, on Saturdays, they pretended they were playing games. And there's evidence for that, documentary evidence. And so they used the tarot, but there may have been, say, if anyone knocked on the door, they were just playing a game, but they weren't working.
They're in worship. It was a sacred time for them.
Because it's the Sabbath, so they're not allowed to work. So I suspect that's the Hebrew alphabet influence that stabilized it to 22. So you have things like the Minkiate, which was also, there was another deck that was only 50 cards, so I've just lost the name.
Right.
50 cards only. The Minkiate was 97 cards.
Yes.
So, you had different types of cards. But eventually really got very clearly articulated to 22 major arcana with this influence. So you've got, if you look at the Hangman, it's definitely the letter, Lamed, which is the 12th letter, number 12 card.
Yes.
You've got in the what we call the magician and the battler, you've got definitely the exact figure, except that way it reverses it, and I'll explain why in a sec, of Aleph, which also means one. You've got Mem, which is the 13th letter, which looks, there's two forms of Mem, but one of the forms looks like there's a scythe going, which is the 13th letter.
Yeah, which is Capricornian Saturn type.
Well, again,
from an astrological.
Yeah, the astrology. I'll come back to the astrology. Okay. If I don't, remind me. You've got the 11th letter, which looks like this, which is exactly the highlight of the form of the lion's mouth, which is also related to strength, which is the 11th card, the 11th letter. So you've got, and there's others as well. I'm just pointing a few, and then the meaning of some of those letters are clearly there. With the astrology, it's again fascinating because you have. So I'll go to weight for a sec, and I'll come back to what I was saying. So weight, I'll go a little bit before weight. In 1888, you have the formation in England of what's called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn.
Yes, and that led on to. We can talk about how that evolved over time, but let's start there.
Okay. And on the continent, you have another order called the Kabbalistic Order of the Rose Cross.
The Rosicrucians, really?
Well, no, the Rosicrucians were a bit before. They call themselves the Kabbalistic Order of the Rose Cross. Worth and Pappas and people like that were involved in that. And there's a Worth deck, there's a Pappas deck, and they were very influential as well. But what happens is that both of those take as their, from a tarot perspective, both of those take as their information, fundamental information, Eliphas Levi or Alphonse Louis Constant. And Eliphas Levi was probably the most influential esotericist around the mid-1800s. And he met with two of the founders of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and he showed them this Hebrew letter association with the tarot. And so
that had been lost, or
well, it had actually been mentioned in its 1781 book called it was an encyclopedia. In volume 8, there were 2 essays, and one of them made a correlation with the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. But what happened is that with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the main characters that formed that were all members of what's called SRIA, the Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, which is a Masonic Rosicrucian society. Remember, these young men were in their 20s at the time. They weren't our age, okay? They were in their 20s. They talked to Eliphas Levi, who's well-aged by then and is regarded as the magus to get the information from. And they put out these letters. And remember, they're going to use it for their ritual, for their own ritual and their own symbolic ways of viewing things. It wasn't meant to go out to the world. It was a restricted society that allowed women in it as well. So, which was relatively rare at the time. So they put out all these letters, and Mathers, who's one of the founders, he's married to the sister of Henry Bergson. Henry Bergson is probably one of the most influential French philosophers at the time. He actually won the Nobel Prize for Literature, I think, in 1920 or thereabouts. Anyway, so what happens is that they put out the letters and then they move the cards around
Yes.
And I said, well, if we put the Fool first, that goes with Aleph. So Aleph means one.
Yes.
Eliphas Levi and the Western tradition, the continental Western tradition places Aleph with what we call the magician. They place it, they put the Fool as though it has a 0. Every other tradition places it either last or second last.
Yes.
Which means everything gets moved. So Beth with the second letter, which means 2, they're now placed with card number 1. Gimel, which means 3, they're now placed with card number 2. In Spain, they don't do that. In France, they don't do that. In Switzerland, they don't do that. In Russia, they don't do that.
But they have a Russian version of the tarot?
Yes, so there was a very influential... well, they mainly used the Marseille style, but there was also a very influential deck called... sorry, I've just got a blank there. It came out around that time as well. There's Larsenik was based on that. Larsenik was a Polish one, I think, from around 1917 or thereabouts. 1917 is also the year of the Russian Revolution, which sees a lot of some of the esoteric work just totally wiped out. Although one of them, Dmitry Sudovsky, actually escapes and comes to Melbourne and uses the name Muni Sadhu. He teaches at Melbourne Uni languages, but for his work on tarot, he uses his esoteric name Muni Sadhu. So anyway, but let's go back to this. So what happens is that as they put as the Golden Dawn puts all these cards down, they say if we invert cards 8 and 11, strength and justice, then we can say that this card is linked to, I'll see if I'll show you. I've only got the major arcana here for a reason. So I'll just take...
Here's Justice sitting on the
on
her throne.
Yeah, so this deck is from, I don't know if you can, does it?
Yes.
So this deck is a late-ish deck.
Beautiful deck.
But it's based...
So what have we got
So
here?
basically we've got numbers, 8 and 11.
Yes.
So if
Justice and strength.
So if you look at... and which one's 8?
Justice.
And which one's strength?
It's 11, yeah.
Right. Now, if I can just take the...
So he's opening the lines, the dragon's mouth and jaws. It's always a lion.
That's right.
Creature.
If you look at the other one, it looks more like a lion. But, okay, there's strength. If you look at strength there... So can you just get strength up for a sec?
Yeah.
Okay, so
and
here...
8's the number of infinity as well, and he's got the infinity sign above his head too, isn't it? Sort of.
Yeah, but what number's there?
There's 8. Yeah. Sorry, that's 11. Yeah, okay.
So basically what happens is they invert the numbers 8 and 11.
Right.
So that in the Waite deck, or in the Waite-Smith deck, you have these two cards inverted to the tradition. So here you've got 11 in the...
For justice.
Yep.
And here we've got 8.
Right. So that makes, excuse me, I'll just put this here.
The justice holding the scales, which we always associate with justice.
Yeah.
We also associate with Libra too, don't we? So astrologically.
Again, this is what Waite does, because the Golden Dawn does that.
And the lion we associate with Leo too, don't we? But
well, you're associating the lion. If I just show you this figure,
yes,
and you hadn't read any books at all on tarot, you hadn't read anything at all on tarot, I would say, which is the stronger of the two figures that are in there? Is it the woman or is it the lion? Which one has the strength, the inner strength? So why not associate that with Virgo?
Okay. Yeah.
So the thing is that because the Golden Dawn,
the feminine at that time of the year is, it's going back to sort of the agricultural influence in astrology, Virgo representing that time of cultivation.
Well, I'm saying, why wouldn't you? I'm not suggesting you have to.
Yeah.
But the thing is that because of the Golden Dawn's letter association, and also each of the Hebrew letters from a 2nd century book called the Sefer Yetzirah has got astrological associations, they said, oh, it will fit if we actually invert them by placing Aleph with 0, and therefore the others go on to.
So what about the Wheel of Fortune? Now that's always been an interesting one to me. It's got astrological connotations in it, but also.
You mean in the weight?
Yes.
Smith
deck? Is that the
okay?
original?
So no. So the Wheel of Fortune in this deck is actually copied from a design by Eliphas Levi in one of his books on ceremonial magic.
Yeah, it has a magical sort of feeling to it.
Yeah. So this one here is virtually a replica of a 1850 book that has nothing to do with tarot but to do with magic. If you look at the Wheel of Fortune,
so many influences.
Traditionally,
you can.
Yeah, if you look at the Wheel of Fortune, what happens is that I'll go to a more traditional one.
So these are Hebrew letters.
Yes, it spells that one. It actually spells Yod-Heh-Vod-Heh, which is Jehovah, which is
Okay.
Now here, this representation.
Yes.
Is more from probably one of the most influential philosophical books of all time. It's called Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, and in there he introduces this Wheel of Fortune, and from the 4th century, I think it's the 4th century onwards, especially around the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. The Wheel of Fortune was just absolutely everywhere. Okay, in terms of miniature representations, it's actually on some of the large 13th century cathedrals as well. Some of those wheels are larger than the height of this room, made of stone. So you've got these incredible representations, and the Wheel of Fortune, Fortuna.
Like the Wheel of Life. I mean, is it the?
Excuse me. Fortuna. It's a little bit different to the Wheel of Samskara, but there is one representation that seems to be that, because you have a youth growing up until his peak to be in Mars, going down to be the old man, and then
Capricorn.
Death. Capricorn or Saturn,
yeah,
and then death. So you've got this Samskara kind of wheel in some representations, but it usually has 3 or 4 people on there. And the wheel, sometimes Fortuna herself is represented, and she just turns the wheel. You can go from being on top of the world to suddenly finding yourself desolate. You can be desolate, and Fortune turns her wheel again, and you can suddenly win Lotto, since we were talking about Lotto before. So and become, or have an incredible relationship that turns sour, or have a sour relationship that turns actually wonderful. So it can be in a whole range of things. It's also allowing that to not despair by the changing
cycles
of life, and the things that can come your way. I'm just going to show you one other thing about the changes, and that is to do with. So
I think they were good changes that came in through the Golden Dawn.
I think,
or the changes that were only relevant in a historical context.
Well, they weren't even meant to be popular. That's the thing.
What you're talking. They were a sect that incorporated these changes because it was something that was important to them, and they valued, and they wanted to incorporate it into their.
They did, but there's 2 other things that happened, and one of them is that Waite himself also had a second set of tarots painted to use for the rituals, because he thought that even his deck, even this deck, and even the Golden Dawn deck didn't quite match what he wanted to encapsulate. This other deck, I know has been published. I can't remember if it's been printed or not. It's been published in a book. A fantastic set of paintings.
Right.
And of course, the other one that's been really influential from the Golden Dawn is Alistair Crowley. And Crowley's deck, which he also names, there were other decks called the Book of Thoth. He names that as well.
Which goes back to the Egyptians, doesn't it? Where
Yes,
I started at the beginning.
Okay, so
is there an Egyptian influence? As soon as you mentioned the Book of Thoth, I go, okay, is this something that's been added on later on just to...
Okay, I'll answer that straight away and then I'll come back to that. What happened is in 1781.
Right.
So remember, around that time, there was an Egyptian madness that swept Europe.
You had the American War of Independence, 1776.
Yeah.
And the French Revolution was 10 years later.
Which was actually 1788.
So you're in a very volatile time in history.
Yeah, but you also have a huge amounts of resources being put into going into Egypt and to find the source of all knowledge and all that. So, but what happens then is that
who was financing that?
In part the French and the other royalties, but the French were putting an enormous amount.
Because that's part of the reason the French Revolution came about is they became bankrupt. Didn't they? I mean, doing these sort of things wouldn't have helped. But I only really realised recently that without the French, the American patriots wouldn't have won the War of Independence because the French financed the
against the English, basically anything against the English at the time. So, but which is quite ironic, really, because they both lose out. But it's also. But going back to that, one of the things that happens is in that series of encyclopedias, in that encyclopedia,
right.
One of the things I talked about in one of the essays on tarot, so 1781, before the French Revolution, is I think it was the Comte de Melay, said something like, these figures remind me of Egyptian figures. So the tarot must have arisen out of Egypt. And who is the god of learning? Thoth. So they called it the Book of Thoth. But this is not before 1781.
Right.
So before that, again, they even had said, in Paris, they even had said that tarot has been lost, even though the book I write on is from a 1650 deck from Paris. There's another deck also from 1650 looking totally different, called the Parisian deck, now we call it, which has got nothing to do with Egypt either. No, that's right. Yes. So I think, but to be fair, is that Europe or the whole of Europe, there's a kind of underlayer, and this underlayer of knowledge, of spiritual wisdom, of stems from ancient Greeks, stems from Egypt,
and we say
stems from
this underlayer,
the Eleusinian mysteries. So all that is there.
Right.
So it's not as if the concept of justice, for example, is separated from the concept of Ma'at, the goddess Ma'at.
So that brings in this sense of immortality that is, which the Egyptians held strong, and I'm not sure how much that permeated into the Greek culture, but I think it was still there, that there's, which when you're talking about this underlying concept, I just wonder how much of that has got connection, because we're talking about, in the tarot, we're talking about, it's not just this lifetime, is it? I mean, it's
that's right. So, but I think who was it? I've got a blank as to her name. Called it the underground stream.
Right.
There's a deep underground esoteric stream, and she wrote a book by that name too, the underground stream. Sorry, I've forgotten your name if you're watching this. This underground stream is definitely got an Egyptian element. Look, there were temples of Isis and Osiris in the south of France, less than 2,000 years ago. So we're not, this Egyptian influence, this Middle Eastern influence that permeates the whole region is not all separate. The Mediterranean was deeply interconnected, and that included Egypt. But when you're talking about the imagery of the cards as a tarot deck, then that doesn't come from Egypt. But it doesn't mean that the underground stream of philosophical, spiritual, etc., and esoteric thought isn't permeated by the ancient Egyptian, not worldview, but spiritual stream that takes a different route in ancient Greece, that takes again a different route within the Christian framework. I mean, Christianity is extremely integrates the esoteric aspects of the region. So yeah.
Wow, we covered so much. What a incredible.
And we've hardly touched it.
Incredible. I'm sure we've just touched the surface, and there's so much. We actually did get onto some of the deeper concepts, but how that all unfolds in all those areas that we discussed could be the subject of many conversations to follow for sure. So I think we've covered a lot of ground. It's been fascinating. I've enjoyed it as usual. I've learned something. I've learned a lot, particularly some of the history that I wasn't aware of, which I will now go and look into a little bit more. But before I wrap up, I just want to remind viewers that we have the Young Up Wellness Expo on again this year, and it's the 27th of October, and it's at Caves House where it was last year. We had a great turnout last year. John Michell will be talking there, and so if you want to know more about the tarot or anything on any of these subjects that we've covered, come along on the 27th of October to Caves House for the Young Up Wellness Expo. And if you want to know more about the history of tarot, then look up this book by Jean Michel. He's the author, the internationally recognised author, Reading the Marseille Tarot.
Yeah, so if you go to my site, fourhairs.com, that's FOURHARES, as in four rabbits, fourhairs.com. There's a link to the Lulu site. It's a print on demand. Please don't get it through Amazon. They get more money than I do if you get it through Amazon. So, yeah. And I don't get much.
Thanks again.
Thank
it's been
you,
a pleasure.
David. Yeah.